The suitcase was still open on the bed when my phone buzzed. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, already sensing that whatever message waited for me would twist the night in a direction I hadn't planned. The room smelled like familiar laundry detergent and old wood, my parents' house, unchanged in all the ways that made it feel both safe and temporary. Why would you leave now? The message read. She finally came to stay with me. You didn't have to disappear. I sat down slowly, the edge of the mattress pressing into my legs, and felt that familiar mix of guilt and disbelief settle in my chest. I'm 42 years old, Hes 46, and somehow I was being made to feel like I'd done something cruel by giving space. To understand how we got here, you have to understand the pattern. My ex and I were together for 3 years. Not married, no shared children, but deeply intertwined in the way long-term relationships tend to become. I knew about his daughter from the beginning. I also knew he didn't see her often, not because he didn't want to at least. That's what he always said, but because the relationship with her mother was strained, complicated, and filled with unspoken resentment. When his daughter did come to visit, it was rare, special, heavy with expectation. I had always tried to be respectful of that. I never pushed myself into their time together. I didn't compete for attention. I didn't pretend I understood the dynamic better than I did. I was careful, almost overly so, because I knew I wasn't the priority in those moments and I shouldn't be. The visit that sparked everything came unexpectedly. She's coming this weekend, he told me, excitement and nerves tangled in his voice. Just the two of us. I want to do it right. I nodded. Of course. That's really good. That night, I thought about the logistics. Our apartment wasn't large. One bathroom, thin walls, a teenager who barely knew me, and a father desperate to make every second count. So I made a decision that felt obvious. I think you'll stay at my parents' for the weekend, I said. That way you can have real space. No awkwardness. No pressure. He looked at me strangely. You don't have to do that. I know, I said, but I want to. At the time, he didn't argue. I packed a small bag. My parents welcomed me without questions. I told myself I was doing the mature thing, the supportive thing, the thing that showed I understood my place in the situation. But the longer I stayed there, the more distant he became. His messages grew short. His tone cooled. When I came back a few days later, something was off. The apartment felt different, quieter, but not peacefully so. Finally, he said it. It hurt that you left, he told me. It felt like you didn't want to be around. Like you abandoned me when things mattered. I stared at him, stunned. I left so you could focus on her, I said. You said you wanted it to be special. I wanted you there, he replied. I wanted her to see my life. All of it. That was the first time I realized we weren't talking about the same thing at all. To him, my absence wasn't support, it was rejection. To me, staying would have felt intrusive, like forcing myself into a moment that wasn't about me. The argument didn't end that night. It resurfaced again and again, reshaped each time into something heavier. You always remove yourself, he said once. You don't fight for your place, he said another time. You make yourself small and then resent me for it. I tried to explain that space wasn't punishment, that leaving didn't mean I didn't care, that sometimes love looks like stepping back. But nothing I said landed. Eventually, we broke up for reasons bigger than this, but somehow still tied to it. Communication, expectations, his tendency to interpret boundaries as abandonment. And now, months later, he was still holding that weekend against me. That's why his message that night at my parents' house hit so hard. I replayed everything in my head. Was I wrong for leaving? Was I supposed to stay and quietly exist in the background? Was giving space actually avoidance? Or was I being punished for not centering myself in a moment that was never mine? I never asked him to choose between me and his daughter. I never complained about the time they spent together. I never made it about my feelings until he forced me to, and that's the part that still unsettles me. Somehow, my attempt to be considerate became evidence that I didn't care enough. So now I'm sitting here, 42 years old, wondering if I misunderstood something fundamental. Was I really the asshole for sleeping at my parents' house, so my ex-boyfriend could have uninterrupted time with the daughter he rarely sees? Or was that just the moment I finally saw how differently we define love? The days after that message blurred together in a way that made me question my own memory. At first, I tried to respond carefully. I didn't want to escalate things. We were already broken up, after after all. And I kept reminding myself that revisiting old arguments rarely leads anywhere good. Still, something about the accusation lodged itself deep inside me. I didn't disappear, I wrote back. I gave you space because you said this time with her mattered. He replied hours later, that's the problem. You always decide what people need instead of asking. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. I replayed the weekend again, this time searching for flaws in my own thinking. Maybe I should have asked more directly. Maybe I should have stayed the first night and then left. Maybe I should have trusted that he meant it when he said I didn't need to go. But every version of the story led back to the same feeling I'd had before I packed that bag, that my presence would complicate something fragile. I remembered the way his daughter barely met my eyes the few times we'd crossed paths before. Polite, distant, clearly unsure what to make of me. I remembered how tense he became whenever the topic of her mother came up. How careful he was with his words, how loaded every visit felt. I didn't want to be another variable in that equation. When I finally went back to the apartment after the visit, the emotional temperature had shifted. He was affectionate in flashes, then withdrawn, almost as if he resented me for not being part of a memory he was still processing. Over dinner one night, he said, she asked where you were. I paused. And what did you tell her? That you were busy. There was something in his tone that made me uneasy. Did she seem upset? He shrugged. Hard to tell. She doesn't open up much. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me feel like I'd failed some invisible test. Later, during another argument, he finally said the part had been circling. I wanted her to see that I had someone, that I wasn't alone. The room went quiet. I looked at him, realizing how to me that weekend was about his daughter. To him, it was about presenting a version of his life complete, stable, validated. You didn't tell me that, I said. I shouldn't have to. He snapped. If you cared, you would have stayed. That was the moment something inside me hardened, because caring, to me, had never looked like performing a role. It had looked like listening, like stepping back, like prioritizing a child who already felt displaced. And suddenly, I saw a pattern I hadn't wanted to acknowledge before. He often framed his emotional needs as unspoken expectations, then punished me for not meeting them. He interpreted independence as distance, boundaries as rejection, silence as abandonment. When I didn't anticipate what he wanted, he assumed I didn't want him. After we broke up, friends weighed in, some gently, some bluntly. You did nothing wrong, one said immediately. That was considerate. Another hesitated. I can see why he might felt hurt, but that doesn't mean you were wrong. My parents, who had watched me arrive that weekend with a mix of relief and quiet concern, were more direct. You've spent a long time adjusting yourself around his feelings, my mother said. When does someone adjust for yours? That question lingered. I realized how often I'd minimized myself in that relationship, how often I'd chosen the least disruptive option, how often I'd preemptively removed myself to avoid being a problem, and yet I was still being told I hadn't done enough. The more distance I got, the clearer it became. The issue wasn't that I went to sleep at my parents' house. The issue was that he wanted reassurance in a moment that wasn't about him and couldn't accept it. When reassurance didn't come in the form he preferred. I never told him not to involve me in his life. I never asked him to choose. I never demanded priority. I just chose not to center myself. And somehow that became the unforgivable thing. Now, when I think back to that weekend, I don't feel shame anymore. I feel sadness. Not because I left, but because staying wouldn't have fixed what was already broken. If I had stayed, the story would have changed. He would have been relieved. I would have been uncomfortable. And eventually, another moment would have arisen where my instincts clashed with his expectations. Because the truth is, the argument wasn't about that weekend. It was about two people who define closeness very differently. And I'm starting to understand that choosing space doesn't make me cold. It makes me self-aware. Even now, I still ask myself the question late at night when doubt creeps in. But each time, the answer feels a little steadier. One didn't leave because I didn't care. I left because sometimes care means knowing when not to be there. And if that wasn't something he could understand, maybe the relationship was never going to survive it anyway. The longer I sat with that realization, the more other moments from our relationship began to rearrange themselves in my memory, lining up in a way that was impossible to ignore. There was the time he accused me of being distant because I didn't insist on meeting his ex-wife sooner. The way had grown cold when I encouraged him to take solo trips with his daughter. instead of turning them into shared experiences. The subtle disappointment in his voice whenever I didn't automatically place myself at the center of his emotional world. At the time, I had interpreted those moments as misunderstandings, differences in communication, things that could be talked through if we just tried harder. Now I saw them as evidence of something deeper. He didn't just want a partner, he wanted validation, and he wanted it in ways that left very little room for nuance. I remembered one evening, months before the breakup, when Head said something that unsettled me but hadn't fully registered until much later. "I like that you don't need much from me," Head said, almost admiringly. "It makes things easier." Aitah smiled then, thinking he meant independence, emotional maturity. What he really meant was that my self-containment spared him from discomfort. So when I removed myself that weekend, not as a test or a punishment but as a conscious act of consideration, it disrupted the dynamic Head grown used to. I was no longer quietly orbiting his needs. I was making a choice without asking permission, and that, more than my absence, was what hurt him. A few weeks after our last exchange, I ran into him unexpectedly at a grocery store. It was the kind of place we used to shop together, arguing over brands and laughing in the aisles. Seeing him there jolted me in a way I hadn't anticipated. We exchanged polite greetings, surface-level questions. His posture was guarded, his smile tight. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm okay," I said, realizing it was true. He hesitated, then said, "She's gone back to her mom's. I won't see her again for a while." I felt the familiar pull to comfort him rise instinctively, followed by something newer and steadier that stopped me from stepping into that role again. "I hope the time you had was good," I said. He studied my face as if searching for something. "Regret, maybe, or guilt. You know," he said slowly, "I think if you'd stayed, things might have turned out differently." There it was again. The revision of history. The implication that the outcome rested on my willingness to sacrifice my instincts. I shook my head gently. "I don't think so." He frowned. "Why not?" "Because the problem wasn't where I slept that weekend," I said. "It was that we wanted different things from the same moment." He didn't respond, just nodded once curtly and walked away. I stood there for a long time afterward, gripping the handle of my cart, feeling strangely lighter. For the first time, I wasn't trying to make him understand. In the months that followed, I rebuilt routines that belonged solely to me. Quiet mornings, evenings without emotional negotiations, relationships that didn't require constant calibration. Sometimes I still questioned myself. That voice didn't disappear overnight. It whispered during moments of loneliness, during holidays, during the small, human longing to be chosen. But each time it did, I returned to the facts. I had acted with intention. I had acted with respect. I had acted without resentment. And I had still been blamed. That told me everything I needed to know. I don't regret going to my parents' house that weekend. I regret that my attempt to be considerate was reframed as abandonment. I regret that my boundaries were interpreted as a lack of love instead of a form of it. But mostly, I regret how long it took me to trust my own judgment. If I had stayed, I would have been present physically but absent emotionally, monitoring my every move so as not to disturb a fragile dynamic. If I had stayed, I would have been performing support instead of offering it freely. And love that requires performance is not love I want anymore. So when I ask myself now whether I was wrong, I answer honestly. I didn't go to my parents' house to escape. I went there to make room. And if that choice revealed a fundamental mismatch between us, then maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe it was the clearest moment of truth we ever had. After that grocery store encounter, I expected the doubts to return stronger than before. Instead, something unexpected happened. The questions began to lose their urgency. I still thought about him, about his daughter, about that weekend that had somehow become symbolic of everything that went wrong between us. But the thoughts no longer carried the same emotional charge. They felt more like reflections than accusations. I started paying attention to how my body reacted when I remembered certain moments. When I imagined staying in the apartment that weekend, tiptoeing around, trying to be invisible, wondering if my presence made things awkward, I felt tension in my shoulders, a tightness in my chest. When I imagined packing my bag and driving to my parents' house, there was sadness, yes, but also relief. That contrast mattered. I realized realized that for much of the relationship, I had learned to ignore my own physical signals. I'd overridden them with logic, with empathy, with the desire to be easy and understanding. I told myself that discomfort was temporary, that compromise was a virtue, that love meant flexibility. But flexibility, taken too far, had turned into self-erasure. One afternoon, months later, I met a friend for coffee, someone who had watched a relationship from the outside with a quiet, concerned eye. We talked about work, about life, about small things, until the conversation naturally drifted back to him. "Do you ever think," she asked carefully, "that no matter what you did, it would have been wrong?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked. She leaned back. "If you stayed, you'd be accused of intruding. If you left, you were accused of abandoning. There was no version where you won." I sat with that for a moment, then nodded slowly. That was exactly it. The problem wasn't my decision. The problem was that my decision existed at all, independent of his emotional needs. He wanted me close but on his terms, present but adaptable, supportive but silent when necessary. And the moment I made a choice rooted in my own judgment, one that didn't revolve around anticipating his feelings, it broke the illusion that I could always be shaped to fit. I thought again about his daughter, about how little control she had over any of this. How many expectations were placed on a short visit. How much pressure he carried to make those moments meaningful. In some strange way, I realized that my choice had also been about her, about not inserting myself into a fragile relationship that needed room to breathe, about not turning her visit into a performance of happy family, when the reality was far more complicated. I never told him that part, not fully. I suspect he wouldn't have heard it anyway. As time passed, I noticed something else changing. The way I related to space itself. I no longer feared it. I no longer rushed to fill silence or justify distance. Space became something neutral, even healthy, a place where clarity could grow instead of resentment. I dated a little, cautiously. Nothing serious at first, but I paid attention to how people reacted when I expressed needs or stepped back, or didn't automatically merge my life with theirs. When someone interpreted my boundaries as rejection, I noticed it immediately. When someone respected them without question, I felt myself relax. That difference became a compass. One night, while cleaning out old emails, I came across a draft I'd never sent to him. It was written shortly after that weekend, full of explanations and reassurances. I'd tried to articulate why I left, how much I cared, how it wasn't a reflection of my feelings for him. Reading it now, I felt a strange mix of tenderness and grief for the woman who wrote it. She had tried so hard to be understood. I deleted the draft without regret, not because the feelings weren't real, but because I no longer believed they needed defending. I didn't make a mistake by giving him space. I made a choice based on empathy and self-respect. If that choice exposed an incompatibility, then it served its purpose. I understand now that love doesn't require me to shrink or hover or perform. It doesn't punish me for trusting my instincts. It doesn't reinterpret consideration as abandonment. And maybe that's the quiet truth at the center of all this. That weekend wasn't a failure of communication or timing. It was a moment of alignment with myself. I went to my parents' house to let a father have uninterrupted time with his daughter. I went there to avoid it becoming a source of tension in a moment that was already heavy. I went there because it felt right. And no amount of rewriting the story will change that. If that makes me the asshole in his version, then I can live with that. Because in my own version, I acted with care, clarity, and honesty, and I didn't lose myself in the process. After that realization, life seemed to unfold with a strange kind of stillness. Not stagnant, not empty, but deliberate. The spaces I had once feared, empty apartments, quiet evenings, weekends without plans, suddenly felt like breathing room rather than punishment. I began to notice the small ways my own life had been constrained. How much energy I had spent anticipating reactions, softening my words, shrinking my presence so that others wouldn't feel discomfort. One morning, I found myself sipping coffee at my parents' kitchen table, the sunlight falling across the counter, and I realized I hadn't thought about him in a way that carried weight for days. Just a passing awareness, the kind that doesn't make your chest tight or your stomach knot. That awareness felt oddly like freedom. I started journaling again, something I had abandoned in my 20s, telling the story of my life in my own words rather than retelling it through the lens of someone else's expectations. I wrote about the weekend, about my choice to step back, about the guilt and second-guessing, and, most importantly, about the clarity I had gained. Writing wasn't catharsis in a dramatic sense, it was cataloging truth. Each sentence affirmed that I had acted intentionally, with care, and without malice. Months later, I met someone new. He wasn't my ex, and he wasn't anyone I'd ever expected to connect with on that level. He listened. He respected boundaries. He never interpreted independence as distance or empathy as abandonment. At first, I hesitated. Years of recalibrating my actions to accommodate someone else's emotional gravity had left me wary. But gradually, the trust I had withheld out of caution began to reappear. We spoke about relationships, about parenting, about mistakes and regrets. I didn't hide my history, and I didn't gloss over the ways I had once been unfairly blamed. And in return, I didn't feel judged or pressured. It was a revelation to realize that someone could care deeply, without demanding that I erase myself to accommodate them. Even so, I thought about that weekend often, not with bitterness, but with perspective. I saw now that my decision to give him and his daughter space wasn't just about them. It was about asserting my right to participate in relationships on my own terms. I wasn't leaving to punish him. I wasn't leaving to distance myself emotionally. I was leaving because I understood that stepping back could sometimes be the kindest act, and that protecting a fragile connection often meant knowing when not to insert yourself. Occasionally, I'd receive a message from him. Short, neutral, sometimes tinged with lingering hurt. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. It wasn't malice, it was acceptance, mine and his, of the fact that some chapters closed without ceremony, without closure in the form of conversation or apology. Some chapters end simply because that's the natural conclusion. During the holidays, I returned to my parents' house again, not because I had to, but because it was home. The apartment was quiet. The city outside was loud, and in that quiet, I recognized the difference between fear and choice. Fear keeps you tethered. Choice sets you free. By the time a full year had passed, the emotional weight of that weekend had transformed. It was no longer a point of contention, nor a mark of failure. It was a reference point, a reminder of what it meant to honor both others and myself. It reminded me that empathy is multifaceted, that love doesn't always mean presence, and that respect can be demonstrated even when you are not physically there. I still think about him sometimes, about the fleeting moments with his daughter, about what he might have felt, but I no longer let those thoughts dictate my actions or my sense of self-worth. I understand now that I am not responsible for controlling how others feel. I am only responsible for acting with integrity and care within my own boundaries. The clarity that came from that weekend and from every subsequent reflection gave me a framework for all relationships moving forward. I learned to trust myself, to give space without guilt, and to assert boundaries without fear of reprisal. I learned that sometimes love is quiet, and sometimes love means stepping back. And I learned that choosing yourself doesn't negate your care for others, it defines it. By the time the second year rolled around, I could recount the weekend without hesitation, without recrimination, and without self-doubt. The suitcase I had packed that night remained in the closet. A simple reminder that leaving didn't mean abandoning, it meant giving space, honoring priorities, and acting with conscious intent. And finally, for the first time in years, I realized I was no longer waiting for validation. I was no longer rehearsing apologies that weren't mine to give. I was no longer shrinking myself to fit someone else's vision of what love should look like. I had acted with intention. I had acted with care. And in that, I had finally found peace. As the months stretched into another year, life slowly began to feel less like a series of calculated choices, and more like something I could move through, without constantly weighing the consequences of every action. I still thought about that weekend from time to time, not as a wound, but as a lesson in how boundaries function, and how love doesn't always demand your presence, and in how your intentions can be misread even when they are pure. I began to notice subtle changes in myself. Mornings were quieter in a way that felt deliberate, not empty. I didn't wake up automatically bracing for judgment or trying to anticipate someone else's emotional reactions. I could sip my coffee and read the news, or scroll through emails, or plan my day without that constant inner commentary about how I might be failing someone. It was a relief I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Occasionally, I ran into people who knew him, acquaintances, mutual friends, neighbors, and I realized I didn't need to explain. The old anxiety about how I would be perceived was fading. The stories people told about me didn't have the power they once did, because I no longer relied on external approval for validation. I had stopped shrinking to make someone else feel comfortable. Even communication with him became a test of boundaries. On a rare occasion, had message short, polite, occasionally awkward. I didn't respond immediately, and when I did, it was measured, factual, devoid of defensiveness or explanation. I had learned that engagement didn't require surrender. I could acknowledge his words without being drawn into his emotional gravity. One afternoon, I found myself reflecting on the daughter he had visited that weekend. I didn't know her well, never had, but the memory of her fleeting presence weighed on me in a new way. I thought about what it must have been like for her rare moments with a father, trying to navigate a complicated family dynamic, carrying all the unspoken tension between adults, and I realized with clarity that my choice to give space hadn't just protected me, it had allowed that time between father and daughter to exist without interference, without competition, without me occupying a space that wasn't mine to fill. That perspective brought a strange comfort. I wasn't responsible for their relationship, nor for how he interpreted my actions, but I could recognize the intention behind what I had done. Care expressed through absence, respect expressed through space, and that was enough. The experience also taught me to recognize patterns in other areas of my life. I started noticing when friends expected me to prioritize their needs over mine consistently, or when colleagues tried to define my boundaries for me. I became more assertive, not in anger, but in understanding. My participation in someone's life was a choice, and my absence didn't equate to lack of care. I dated a little more intentionally, too. Early on, I met someone patient who didn't mistake autonomy for distance, who didn't interpret boundaries as rejection. It was unfamiliar at first to have someone respect the spaces I created, to see that independence could coexist with connection, but it was liberating. I realized that many of my past struggles had been tied to relationships that demanded conformity to someone else's emotional script. Now, I could engage on equal terms, negotiating love rather than performing it. Holidays were still complicated. I spent them at my parents' house more often than not, creating rituals that centered on calm rather than obligation. But the difference was that now, I could participate fully, choosing which moments mattered and which didn't without guilt for every unspoken expectation. I also revisited the apartment where we had lived together. Walking through it brought back memories, some bittersweet, some painful, but none paralyzing. I realized I could honor those experiences without being consumed by them. I could acknowledge that I had made choices guided by thoughtfulness and self-respect, and that my judgment had been correct in leaving space rather than inserting myself where I wasn't needed. Even the suitcase that had traveled with me that weekend remained in the closet, a silent reminder of the turning point it represented. I no longer saw it as a symbol of abandonment or guilt. It was evidence of discernment, of understanding that love, care, and respect can sometimes be expressed by absence rather than presence. Over time, I stopped framing the weekend as a moral dilemma. I stopped replaying it in my head as a scenario where I might have been wrong. Instead, it became a reference point. The moment I learned that acting with intention sometimes conflicts with others' expectations, and that was not inherently wrong. I had acted with clarity, with respect, and with love in a way that aligned with my values. And slowly, imperceptibly, life began to feel lighter. My choices no longer carried the weight of unseen judgment. I could enjoy quiet evenings without rehearsing explanations. I could engage with friends, family, and potential partners without the undercurrent of self-doubt that had defined so many years. I could exist fully in my own presence, confident that the decisions I made were consistent with the person I wanted to be. Years later, I could recount that weekend without tension or regret. The narrative no longer revolved around accusations or misunderstandings. It was a story about intentionality, about empathy, and about understanding the complex ways care can be expressed. It was a story about how I chose to honor someone else's relationship while maintaining my own integrity. In the end, I understood that the weekend and all the turmoil it caused wasn't a test I had failed. It was a lesson in discernment, in boundaries, and in the quiet, sometimes uncomfortable ways that respect and love manifest. I didn't need approval. I didn't need reconciliation. I didn't need validation. I needed only to act with clarity and to trust that my intentions were enough. And in that trust, I finally found peace. By the time I finally let the story rest, it no longer carried tension, guilt, or questions of right and wrong. The weekend, the suitcase, the messages, all of it had transformed into a quiet lesson I could carry without weight. I realized that leaving my own space to give him and his daughter time together had never been selfish. It had been intentional, considerate, and necessary. The discomfort it caused him did not negate the care behind my choice, and my absence had preserved something fragile. Without harming anyone, it had simply honored the moment for what it was. I no longer needed to justify myself. I no longer replayed scenarios or feared judgment. I understood that respect, empathy, and love can sometimes take the form of stepping back rather than stepping in. That weekend became a symbol not of conflict but of clarity, a reminder that acting with intention, even when misunderstood, is always the right choice for the person you are trying to honor most yourself. And with that understanding, I could finally let it go.